The heavy pressurized cabin door of the massive commercial airliner was exactly 3 minutes away from completely sealing shut. I was sitting in row 12, my forehead resting against the cold, vibrating acrylic glass of the window. I had not slept in exactly 48 hours. My father had suffered a massive, fatal heart attack exactly 3 days ago, and I was flying directly back to Chicago for the mandatory, legally binding estate probate hearing scheduled for precisely 2 o'clock this afternoon. My father was a deeply cynical, highly successful corporate liquidator. He built a staggering $40 million empire by dismantling failing companies. And he drafted his final testament with the exact same ruthless, uncompromising precision. He named me as the sole, primary executor of the estate. The heavy, rhythmic hum of the jet engines began to vibrate through the floorboards. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to quiet my racing mind. Then the engines abruptly whined down into complete silence. The loud, sharp crackle of the public address system echoed through the cabin. The flight attendants, who had been rapidly conducting their final safety checks, instantly stopped moving. Before the captain could even speak, the heavy cabin door at the front of the aircraft violently swung open. It was not a late passenger. It was not a gate agent carrying final flight manifests. Marching aggressively onto the airplane were 4 heavily armed, fully tactical officers from the Transportation Security Administration and the Federal Airport Police. They wore dark, heavy bulletproof vests over their uniforms, their hands resting entirely too close to their holstered service weapons. The 300 exhausted passengers instantly froze. A heavy, suffocating silence violently sucked the oxygen directly out of the cabin. The lead officer, a massive, broad-shouldered man with a deeply unyielding expression, did not look left or right. He marched directly down the narrow, carpeted aisle, his heavy tactical boots thudding loudly against the floor. He was holding a highly detailed digital manifest. He stopped exactly at row 12. He turned his body, completely blocking the aisle, and looked directly down at me. "Unbuckle your seatbelt and stand up immediately," the lead officer commanded. His deep voice boomed through the quiet cabin, completely devoid of any customer service etiquette. "Keep your hands entirely visible and completely empty. Step out into the aisle." My blood instantly turned to freezing ice. My lungs seized, completely refusing to draw in the stale, recycled cabin air. "I am sorry, officer," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly as 300 pairs of terrified, highly judgmental eyes burned directly into the side of my face. "There must be some kind of massive clerical error. I am simply flying home for a family funeral." "There is absolutely no error," the second officer stated coldly, stepping closer and resting his heavy hand directly onto his tactical belt. "Your government identification was formally flagged by the Federal Security Database exactly 15 minutes ago. You are an active, high-level security risk. Grab your personal bag and exit this aircraft immediately, or we will physically remove you from your seat." The words, "high-level security risk," hit the cabin like a physical shockwave. The woman sitting directly next to me violently unbuckled her own seatbelt and physically scrambled backward into the aisle, looking at me as if I were a completely radioactive terrorist about to detonate a massive explosive. The whispering erupted instantly, vicious, frantic, terrified murmurs from the 300 people surrounding me. To be publicly escorted off a massive commercial flight by armed federal agents is not just a misunderstanding. It is a permanent, catastrophic public execution. My hands shook violently as I grabbed my dark leather carry-on bag from under the seat. I did not look at the terrified passengers. I kept my eyes completely glued to the carpeted floor as I walked up the narrow aisle, entirely flanked on both sides by the heavy tactical officers. The walk to the front of the plane felt like it lasted for 3 agonizing hours. The absolute second my feet crossed the threshold of the aircraft, the flight attendants violently slammed the heavy pressurized door shut behind me, completely sealing the plane and locking me entirely out of my flight. They did not take me to the customer service desk. They aggressively marched me through a series of highly restricted keycard access doors, completely bypassing the crowded terminal, and shoved me directly into a freezing, windowless concrete interrogation room located deep in the subterranean bowels of the international airport. The heavy steel door slammed shut, locking from the outside with a massive, highly resonant, metallic click. I was completely trapped. 10 minutes later, the lead officer walked into the freezing room, dropping a thick, heavily redacted federal file directly onto the cold metal table. "Exactly 1 hour ago," the officer began, his voice dropping into a lethal, highly focused interrogation register. "The Federal Security Hotline received a highly detailed, completely anonymous emergency tip. The caller explicitly provided your full legal name, your exact date of birth, and your specific flight confirmation number." He leaned heavily over the table, completely invading my personal space. "The caller formally swore that you were attempting to transport highly restricted, catastrophic digital malware across state lines to execute a massive corporate sabotage," the officer revealed, his eyes narrowing into hostile slits. "Because of the absolute severity of the claim, your identification is currently frozen. You are permanently grounded pending a full, multi-agency digital forensic audit of every single electronic device in your possession. That audit will take a minimum of 72 hours. I stared at the heavy steel door. The air vanished entirely from my lungs. 72 hours. The legally binding estate probate hearing was scheduled to begin in exactly 4 hours in downtown Chicago. The legal stipulations drafted by my ruthlessly cynical father were completely, undeniably uncompromising. If the primary named executor failed to physically stand in the courtroom and sign the heavily notarized oath of office by exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the court would instantly declare a legal default. The $40 million empire would automatically, immediately transfer absolute executive control to the secondary next of kin, my older sister, Evelyn. Evelyn was a vicious, highly manipulative socialite currently drowning in exactly $5 million of massive, high-interest venture capital debt from a spectacular string of entirely failed luxury startups. My father had explicitly cut her out of the primary executive role because he absolutely knew she would completely liquidate his entire corporate empire to cover her massive financial failures. Evelyn had not been hacked. Evelyn had not made a mistake. She had intentionally, completely meticulously called the Federal Security Hotline. She had weaponized the Transportation Security Administration. She had perfectly orchestrated a massive, highly illegal federal kidnapping, completely trapping me in a subterranean concrete room 1,000 miles away, just so she could casually stroll into the Chicago courthouse and legally steal a $40 million inheritance. She thought she had executed the perfect, completely untraceable crime. She thought I would simply sit in this freezing interrogation room and cry. She had absolutely no idea what she had just completely unleashed. "Officer," I said quietly, completely dropping the terrified passenger act and instantly shifting into the cold, lethal, hyper-analytical mindset of a corporate liquidator. "I am going to hand you my completely unlocked laptop right now. But before you call your forensic auditors, I need you to completely reread the exact timeline of that anonymous phone call." The freezing, windowless concrete interrogation room was completely silent, save for the low, mechanical hum of the massive industrial air conditioning unit bolted to the ceiling. The heavy steel door remained completely locked from the outside. The lead federal officer crossed his massive, heavily muscular arms over his dark, bulletproof vest. He did not look impressed. He was a veteran tactical agent, completely accustomed to highly arrogant, wealthy passengers screaming about their constitutional rights and threatening massive lawsuits. He was absolutely not accustomed to a passenger calmly sliding a high-end corporate laptop across the cold metal table and systematically dismantling a federal security threat. "The timeline of the anonymous phone call," the lead officer repeated, his deep voice heavily, layered with profound, cynical skepticism. He looked down at the sleek metal chassis of my completely unlocked computer. "The Federal Security Hotline received the highly detailed threat exactly 1 hour ago. What exactly does the timeline prove?" "It completely proves the absolute, undeniable identity of your anonymous caller," I replied, my voice slicing through the freezing air with lethal, uncompromising precision. "Because I did not book that commercial flight weeks in advance. My father suffered a massive, fatal heart attack exactly 3 days ago. I was completely consumed with making his emergency funeral arrangements." I leaned forward, placing my hands completely flat on the cold metal table, projecting the absolute authority of a corporate executive. "I booked that specific commercial flight exactly 3 hours ago," I stated clearly, letting the incredibly tight mathematical window hang heavily in the interrogation room. The heavily encrypted alphanumeric flight confirmation code was generated and sent directly to my private email server at precisely 9 o'clock this morning. The second officer, standing entirely still near the heavy steel door, subtly shifted his weight. His highly trained investigative instincts were immediately violently triggered by the completely closed timeline. "Only 3 entities possess that exact alphanumeric flight confirmation code," I continued, building the massive, undeniable wall of my defense. "The commercial airline database, myself, and the primary centralized digital calendar of my father's corporate estate, which automatically synced my emergency travel itinerary." I looked directly into the lead officer's completely unyielding eyes. "The caller explicitly provided my specific flight confirmation number to your federal hotline," I pointed out, entirely exposing the massive, fatal flaw in Evelyn's perfectly orchestrated trap. "A random, anonymous cyber terrorist does not casually possess a private, newly generated commercial flight code. But my older sister, Evelyn, who currently holds secondary administrative access to the corporate estate calendar. She received an automated digital notification the absolute second I purchased the ticket." The lead officer did not immediately touch the laptop. He simply stared at me, his thick brow furrowing as the completely logical, heavily forensic narrative began to violently clash with the anonymous threat assessment. "You are currently claiming that a member of your own immediate family intentionally filed a highly detailed, completely fraudulent federal terrorism report," the lead officer summarized, his voice dropping into a low, incredibly dangerous register. "That is a massive, multi-agency federal felony. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 5 years in a federal penitentiary." "She is absolutely willing to risk exactly 5 years in a federal penitentiary," I countered instantly, completely unshakable, because the immediate, absolute financial reward is exactly $40 million. I reached across the cold metal table, placed my finger directly onto the smooth glass trackpad of my laptop, and opened my primary legal folder. "I am the primary named executor of my father's massive commercial liquidation empire," I explained, turning the glowing screen entirely toward the 2 heavily armed federal agents. "The legally binding estate probate hearing is scheduled to begin in a downtown Chicago courtroom in exactly 3.5 hours, at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon." I tapped the screen, opening the heavily notarized, highly complex trust documents. "The legal stipulations drafted by my father are completely, undeniably uncompromising," I revealed, the massive, staggering financial motive completely flooding the freezing concrete room. If the primary named executor fails to physically stand in the courtroom and sign the heavily notarized oath of office by exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the court will instantly declare a catastrophic legal default. The entire $40 million empire automatically, immediately transfers absolute executive control to the secondary next of kin. The lead officer looked down at the glowing screen. He saw the massive, dense legal jargon. He saw the official state seals. And he saw the absolutely staggering $40 million net worth verified by 3 highly respected corporate accounting firms. Evelyn is currently drowning in exactly $5 million of massive, high-interest venture capital debt from a spectacular string of entirely failed luxury startups, I concluded, dropping the final devastating piece of the puzzle directly into his lap. She did not swat my flight because she is terrified of digital malware. She weaponized your Transportation Security Administration to execute a massive, completely undeniable corporate kidnapping. If I am sitting in this freezing, windowless concrete room while the federal judge strikes his gavel, she legally steals $40 million. The massive, suffocating silence violently returned to the interrogation room. The 2 federal officers exchanged a single, highly communicative look. It was the exact look of 2 veteran tactical agents violently realizing they had been spectacularly, completely played by a wealthy, highly manipulative socialite. Federal investigators absolutely despise being lied to. They violently despise being used as unwitting pawns to facilitate massive corporate fraud. The lead officer slowly pulled his heavy digital radio from his tactical belt. "Get the Cybercrimes Division on the secure line immediately," the lead officer commanded into the radio, his voice vibrating with lethal, completely focused federal fury. "I need an immediate, high-priority emergency ping on the anonymous caller's highly encrypted metadata. Pull the voice recording from exactly 1 hour ago. We are running a full voice biometric match against Evelyn's public corporate media profiles." He slammed the heavy digital radio back onto his belt and looked directly at me. The hostile, completely unyielding suspicion had completely vanished from his eyes, instantly replaced by the sharp, highly aggressive intensity of an apex predator, realizing he had been tracking the wrong prey. "We are going to verify your corporate documents right now," the lead officer stated coldly. "If the Cybercrimes Division confirms the biometric voice match, your identification flag will be completely expunged from the federal security database." I did not let out a massive sigh of relief. I checked the heavy silver watch on my left wrist. "That is highly appreciated, officer," I replied, my voice completely tight with rising, suffocating panic. "But it is completely irrelevant. It is currently 11 o'clock in the morning. Even if you completely clear my federal security flag in exactly 10 minutes, the absolute final commercial flight to Chicago departed exactly 15 minutes ago. There is absolutely no physical way for me to reach the downtown probate courtroom by 3 o'clock in the afternoon." Evelyn's sick, completely brilliant plan had a massive, terrifying fail-safe. Even if I successfully talked my way out of the federal interrogation room, the sheer bureaucratic delay had completely destroyed my travel window. I was permanently grounded 1,000 miles away. The $40 million was entirely legally hers. The second officer, standing by the heavy steel door, let out a soft, completely cynical scoff. "You are the primary executor of a $40 million commercial liquidation empire," the second officer pointed out, crossing his heavy arms. "A man with that level of massive corporate wealth does not exclusively rely on commercial airlines. Does the estate own a private corporate jet?" "He owned a massive, highly customized Gulfstream," I confirmed, the bitter reality completely crushing my chest. "But it is completely grounded. Evelyn currently holds secondary administrative power until the probate hearing officially concludes. She intentionally placed a massive, highly restrictive financial freeze on the entire corporate aviation account Exactly 2 days ago. I absolutely cannot legally authorize the jet to take off." The lead officer leaned heavily on the cold metal table, a dark, incredibly dangerous smile slowly spreading across his scarred face. He was a federal agent who had just been deeply, personally insulted by a fraudulent terrorism tip, and he was currently holding absolute, unmitigated authority over the international airport. "Evelyn froze the corporate aviation account," the lead officer repeated, his deep voice carrying the absolute weight of the federal government. But she completely forgot that this airport operates under strict, heavily regulated federal jurisdiction. He aggressively tapped his thick, calloused finger directly onto the metal table. "If the Cybercrimes Division explicitly confirms that your sister filed a fraudulent, highly illegal, federal terrorism report to intentionally ground your commercial flight," the lead officer declared, completely changing the entire trajectory of my life, "then you are no longer just a delayed passenger. You are the direct, highly vulnerable victim of an active federal felony." The heavy steel door suddenly clicked loudly. "And the Transportation Security Administration," the lead officer concluded, standing completely straight, projecting absolute, undeniable federal power, "possesses the emergency, unmitigated legal authority to immediately commandeer any grounded corporate aircraft to securely transport a vulnerable federal victim across state lines." The heavy digital radio attached to the lead officer's tactical belt violently crackled to life exactly 12 minutes later. The sharp, heavily encrypted static completely shattered the suffocating silence of the freezing concrete interrogation room. "Command, this is the Federal Cybercrimes Division," a highly clipped, heavily professional voice announced through the small speaker. "We successfully isolated the encrypted metadata from the anonymous hotline tip recorded exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes ago. We ran a full biometric vocal analysis against the public corporate media profiles belonging to the secondary next of kin, Evelyn." The lead officer did not smile. He simply pressed his thick, callous thumb directly onto the heavy transmission button. "Confirm the exact match percentage," the lead officer demanded, his voice dropping into a lethal, uncompromising register. 99.9% biometric match, sir," the cyber analyst confirmed, completely sealing Evelyn's catastrophic fate. She attempted to digitally disguise her voice with a cheap, commercially available modulation software, but the underlying vocal cord frequencies are absolutely identical. The anonymous caller was unequivocally Evelyn. She explicitly filed a fraudulent federal terrorism report. The lead officer released the transmission button. The radio clicked, completely silent. He slowly turned his head, his sharp, highly trained eyes locking directly onto me. The heavy, unyielding suspicion that had defined our initial interaction was entirely gone. He was no longer looking at a potential terrorist. He was looking at the primary, highly vulnerable victim of a massive federal kidnapping plot, and he was absolutely furious that his agency had been weaponized to facilitate a $40 million corporate theft. "Your government identification is officially, permanently unflagged," the lead officer stated coldly, grabbing the thick, heavily redacted federal file off the cold metal table. "You are completely cleared." He turned to the second officer standing rigidly by the heavy steel door. "Contact the primary control tower immediately," the lead officer commanded, his deep voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of the United States government. "Inform them that the Transportation Security Administration is officially declaring a high-priority emergency federal transport. We are legally commandeering the grounded, heavily customized Gulfstream currently sitting on the private corporate tarmac." I stood up from the cold metal chair, my hands gripping the heavy leather handle of my carry-on bag. The suffocating, paralyzing panic completely vanished from my chest, instantly replaced by a cold, absolutely lethal surge of adrenaline. "Let us go," the lead officer said, pushing the heavy steel door open. They did not march me back through the crowded, chaotic public terminal. They escorted me directly through a series of highly restricted, keycard access maintenance corridors, completely bypassing the massive security checkpoints. We pushed through a set of heavy industrial doors and stepped directly out onto the blindingly bright, incredibly loud concrete expanse of the private aviation tarmac. Sitting exactly 100 yards away was my father's massive, heavily customized corporate Gulfstream jet. The two highly paid corporate pilots were standing near the lowered mechanical stairs, looking completely confused and highly defensive. Evelyn had aggressively frozen the corporate aviation account exactly 2 days ago, explicitly forbidding them from turning on the massive jet engines. The lead officer marched aggressively across the concrete, his heavy tactical boots completely ignoring the standard protocol of the private runway. He walked directly up to the senior pilot. "We absolutely cannot fly this aircraft, officer," the senior pilot stammered, holding up his hands defensively. The secondary corporate administrator placed a massive, legally binding financial freeze on this specific tail number. "We do not have the legal clearance to depart." The lead officer did not argue. He reached into the inner pocket of his dark tactical vest, pulled out a heavy leather wallet and flipped it open, aggressively shoving his shining silver federal badge directly into the pilot's face. "I am completely overriding her administrative financial freeze under the explicit authority of the Federal Aviation Security Mandate," the lead officer boomed, his voice completely drowning out the distant roar of commercial airliners. "This aircraft is officially commandeered for an emergency federal transport. You are going to power up those massive engines right now, and you are going to fly this woman directly to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. You have exactly 1 minute to file your flight plan. Move." The pilot took one look at the heavy silver badge, looked at the heavily armed tactical officer, and immediately turned around, sprinting directly up the mechanical stairs. I followed him, stepping into the massive, hyper-luxurious cabin of the corporate jet. The incredibly plush leather seats and polished wood paneling were a massive, surreal contrast to the freezing concrete interrogation room I had occupied just 20 minutes ago. I sat down in the primary executive leather chair and fastened my heavily polished metal seatbelt. Exactly 4 minutes later, the massive jet engines violently roared to life, pushing me deep back into the soft leather. We did not wait in the massive, winding line of commercial aircraft. The Federal Transport Declaration granted us absolute, unmitigated priority clearance. The Gulfstream shot down the runway and violently tore into the clear blue sky, banking sharply toward Chicago. The flight took exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes. I did not sleep. I stared out the small acrylic window, watching the clouds tear past the massive wings, my mind calculating the exact, precise timeline of my arrival. The legally binding estate probate hearing was scheduled to conclude at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon. If I did not physically sign the heavily notarized oath of office by that exact minute, the $40 million empire automatically defaulted to the woman who had just committed a massive federal felony to steal it. The heavy tires of the Gulfstream violently slammed onto the concrete runway at Chicago O'Hare at exactly 2 hours and 10 minutes past noon. We had exactly 50 minutes remaining. The Gulfstream taxied aggressively toward the private aviation terminal. Through the window, I saw the massive, flashing red and blue strobe lights waiting for us on the tarmac. The lead transportation security officer had not just commandeered a corporate jet, he had made a highly specific, heavily coordinated phone call directly to the Chicago Police Department while we were in the air. Waiting exactly at the bottom of the mechanical stairs were 2 fully marked, heavily armored city police cruisers. I grabbed my dark leather bag, ran down the stairs, and jumped directly into the back seat of the primary police cruiser. The heavy doors slammed shut. The massive sirens violently wailed to life, entirely deafening the surrounding terminal. We tore out of the private aviation gates, aggressively merging onto the massive, heavily congested interstate. The police escort was absolutely flawless. The heavy cruisers completely split the dense, chaotic Chicago traffic like a hot knife violently slicing through butter, running every single red light with absolute, unmitigated authority. We arrived at the massive, towering stone columns of the downtown federal courthouse at precisely 2 hours and 54 minutes past noon. I had exactly 6 minutes to save a $40 million corporate empire. I threw the heavy cruiser door open, sprinting up the wide concrete steps. I bypassed the massive, winding civilian security line, flashing the completely verified, heavily stamped federal transport clearance document the TSA officer had printed for me. The armed federal marshals instantly unhooked the velvet ropes, allowing me to run directly through the metal detectors. I hit the heavy marble floor of the third corridor, my expensive shoes echoing violently against the stone. At the absolute end of the long hallway stood the heavy, imposing oak doors of probate courtroom number 4. Behind those doors, Evelyn was currently sitting at the polished mahogany table, completely surrounded by her high-priced, incredibly slick venture capital lawyers. She was watching the large antique clock on the wall, absolutely certain that she had executed the perfect, untraceable federal kidnapping. She was smiling, perfectly ready to officially sign the corporate transfer and completely liquidate our father's entire legacy. I reached the heavy oak doors, gripping the cold brass handles. I did not knock. I took a massive, deep breath, completely dropping the exhaustion from my shoulders, and violently pushed the heavy wooden doors wide open. The heavy, towering oak doors of Federal Probate Courtroom Number 4 violently slammed against the exterior marble walls. The incredibly loud, concussive crack completely shattered the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the massive room, echoing like a gunshot. I stood completely still in the massive doorway, gripping the heavy leather handle of my dark carry-on bag. I was breathing heavily, my tailored black suit slightly wrinkled from the frantic, high-speed federal police escort, but my posture was completely, absolutely unyielding. I immediately looked up at the large antique clock hanging on the dark wood-paneled wall. It read exactly 2 hours and 54 minutes past noon. I had exactly 6 minutes remaining to completely secure my father's $40 million empire. Sitting at the polished mahogany respondents' table was Evelyn. She was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored crimson-red designer suit. She was completely surrounded by 3 high-priced, incredibly slick venture capital lawyers. In her perfectly manicured right hand, she held an expensive gold fountain pen, hovering literally exactly 1 inch above the heavy, legally binding transfer documents. She was absolutely euphorically certain she had just won. But when the heavy oak doors violently crashed open, Evelyn instinctively looked up. The massive, arrogant, completely victorious smile instantly, permanently froze on her face. The blood violently drained from her heavily moisturized skin, leaving her looking exactly like a terrified wax mannequin. Her lungs entirely seized, trapping the conditioned courtroom air dead in her throat. Her manicured fingers completely lost their grip. The expensive gold fountain pen slipped from her hand and clattered loudly onto the polished mahogany wood. "No," Evelyn whispered, her voice a completely breathless, highly unstable rasp that carried across the silent room. She stared at me in absolute, unadulterated horror. "That is absolutely impossible. You are supposed to be sitting in a locked holding cell. You were permanently grounded. I tracked the commercial flight status. I did not run down the center aisle. I walked. I walked with the slow, deliberate, incredibly heavy cadence of a ruthless corporate liquidator stepping into a completely failed, utterly bankrupt enterprise. The Honorable Judge Davies looked down from the elevated mahogany bench, completely unbothered by the dramatic, breathless entrance. He was a stern, highly practical federal magistrate with 30 years of corporate probate experience. You are cutting it incredibly close to the absolute legal deadline, Judge Davies boomed, his deep voice carrying the absolute weight of the law. The legal default transfers absolute executive control at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I sincerely apologize for the massive delay, Your Honor, I replied, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of the suffocating panic I had felt in the subterranean airport room. I walked directly to the petitioner's table and took my seat, placing my dark leather bag onto the polished floor. I experienced a highly unexpected, federally coordinated transportation issue. Evelyn violently jumped to her feet. Her heavy leather chair crashed backward. "She is late!" Evelyn shrieked, completely losing her high society composure, her voice cracking into a hysterical, desperate screech. "The deadline is functionally past. She completely abandoned the estate. Sign the default transfer right now, Your Honor. The $40 million legally belongs to me." Her 3 high-priced venture capital lawyers immediately flinched, looking at their screaming client with profound, cynical skepticism. I slowly turned my head, locking my eyes directly onto Evelyn's terrified, wildly darting face. "I did not abandon the estate, Evelyn," I stated quietly, my voice dropping into a lethal, freezing register that effortlessly, completely silenced her hysterical screaming. "I was aggressively, forcefully removed from my commercial flight by 4 heavily armed tactical officers from the Transportation Security Administration." A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the small gallery. The court stenographer's fingers flew rapidly across her machine, permanently recording the exact moment Evelyn's $40 million federal felony began to spectacularly disintegrate. "Because exactly 4 hours ago," I continued, projecting the massive, undeniable truth into the surround sound speakers, the Federal Security Hotline received a highly detailed, completely anonymous emergency tip. The caller explicitly swore that I was attempting to transport catastrophic digital malware to execute a massive corporate sabotage. The federal agents locked me in a freezing, windowless concrete interrogation room. They permanently grounded my identification. Evelyn's chest heaved with rapid, shallow, terrified gasps. She took a single shaky step backward, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her pale face. That is a terrible tragedy," Evelyn stammered desperately, frantically trying to completely distance herself from the radioactive crime. "But it has absolutely nothing to do with me. The court cannot pause a legally binding corporate deadline for a random airport delay. The $40 million is mine." I let out a soft, completely humorless scoff. "It was a brilliant, incredibly sick plan to force a bureaucratic kidnapping," I acknowledged, staring directly at the woman who had tried to completely destroy my life. "But you made one massive, catastrophic legal miscalculation, Evelyn. You used a cheap, commercially available modulation software to digitally disguise your voice." Evelyn completely froze. The absolute unmitigated terror finally violently shattered her eyes. "Federal tactical agents absolutely despise being weaponized to facilitate massive corporate fraud," I declared, completely dropping the massive forensic anvil directly onto the polished floor. While I was sitting in that interrogation room, the Federal Cybercrimes Division completely isolated the encrypted metadata from your anonymous phone call. They ran a full biometric vocal analysis. I stood up from the polished mahogany table, completely dominating the massive courtroom. They confirmed a 99.9% exact biometric match to your public, corporate media profiles, I revealed, completely sealing her absolute destruction. The anonymous caller was unequivocally you. You completely fabricated a federal terrorism threat to intentionally ground my flight. The 3 highly aggressive venture capital lawyers standing next to Evelyn officially heard absolutely enough. They smoothly reached down, grabbed their expensive leather briefcases, and immediately, physically backed entirely away from her. They were completely abandoning a highly radioactive client who was about to be federally indicted for a massive, multi-agency felony. I turned completely away from my trembling, ruined sister, looking directly up at the elevated mahogany bench. "The primary executor is completely present, Your Honor," I announced smoothly. Judge Davies glared down at Evelyn with absolute, unfiltered judicial disgust. He seamlessly slid a heavy cream-colored legal document and a thick black fountain pen directly across the polished wood toward me. I looked up at the antique wall clock. It read exactly 2 hours and 58 minutes past noon. I picked up the heavy black fountain pen. I pressed the incredibly sharp metal nib directly onto the thick paper and signed my full, legally binding name on the 3 dotted lines at the bottom of the page. I placed the pen down. The sharp, wooden clatter echoed loudly. "The transfer is formally, legally executed," Judge Davies finalized, aggressively slamming his heavy wooden gavel onto the sounding block with a massive, concussive crack. "The primary executor now holds absolute, unmitigated fiduciary control over the $40 million commercial liquidation empire. The default transfer is permanently entirely voided. The $40 million was permanently, legally locked entirely in my name." Evelyn let out a raw, guttural wail of pure, unadulterated despair. Her massive luxury debt was completely unpayable. She had absolutely nothing. "But I did not just commandeer a corporate Gulfstream jet to secure my inheritance, Evelyn," I whispered, my voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of a corporate liquidator, completely finishing the job. I turned my head slightly, looking directly toward the massive open oak doors at the back of the courtroom. I stood completely still at the polished mahogany petitioner's table, my legally binding signature permanently drying on the $40 million corporate transfer. I slowly turned my head, looking directly past Evelyn's trembling, completely ruined form, and focused entirely on the massive, open oak doors at the back of federal probate, courtroom number 4. A heavy, incredibly intimidating shadow fell across the marble threshold. The lead tactical officer from the Transportation Security Administration, the exact same massive, broad-shouldered man who had forcefully removed me from my commercial flight exactly 4 hours ago, marched aggressively into the courtroom. He was no longer treating me like a high-level security risk. He was currently operating as a completely infuriated federal agent who had personally flown across state lines to arrest the woman who had illegally weaponized his entire agency. He was flanked by 2 fully uniformed, heavily armed federal marshals. Their tactical boots thudded brutally against the polished floor, completely shattering the remaining silence of the cavernous room. Evelyn slowly turned around. The absolute, unadulterated terror violently buckled her knees. The pristine crimson-red fabric of her custom-tailored designer suit suddenly looked like a massive, highly visible target. She violently stumbled backward, her expensive high heels scraping harshly against the wood, desperately trying to put physical distance between herself and the rapidly approaching federal agents. "Evelyn!" the lead federal officer boomed, his deep voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of the United States government. He completely bypassed the wooden gallery benches and walked directly up to the respondent's table. "You are officially under arrest." Evelyn held her perfectly manicured hands up in front of her face, palms facing outward in a completely pathetic, hysterical gesture of surrender. "Wait, please, it was a massive misunderstanding," Evelyn shrieked, her voice a shrill, breathless whine that echoed brutally off the heavy oak panels. "It was just a prank, a family dispute. I was just trying to delay her flight. I did not actually think you would send armed guards onto the airplane. You cannot ruin my life over a completely harmless phone call." The lead officer stopped exactly 2 feet away from her. He did not look amused. Federal investigators absolutely despise wealthy socialites who attempt to rebrand massive federal felonies as harmless family pranks. You completely fabricated a highly detailed, anonymous terrorism threat regarding catastrophic digital malware. The lead officer recited coldly, his voice devoid of any human sympathy. He reached onto his heavy black utility belt and unclipped a pair of cold, solid steel handcuffs. You actively weaponized the Transportation Security Administration to orchestrate a federal kidnapping, and you executed a highly coordinated $40 million wire fraud conspiracy. Turn around and place your hands entirely behind your back. Evelyn did not turn around. She completely collapsed onto the polished wooden floor of the center aisle, weeping loudly, the vibrant crimson red of her luxury suit violently clashing with the dark mahogany wood. The two supporting federal marshals immediately stepped forward. They did not gently coax her up. They grabbed her arms, hauling her completely limp body back to her feet. They forcefully twisted her arms behind her back, entirely ignoring her dramatic, hysterical sobbing. The heavy steel cuffs ratcheted shut around her wrists. The sharp, violent metallic clicks cut through the dead silence of the federal courtroom like gunshots. "You have the absolute right to remain silent," the lead officer declared, beginning the formal Miranda warning as they physically spun her toward the massive exit. "Anything you say can and absolutely will be used against you in a federal court of law." "You cannot do this to me," Evelyn wailed, twisting her head back to look directly at me as the heavy federal marshals marched her aggressively down the center aisle. Her perfectly styled hair was completely ruined, hanging wildly across her tear-stained, pale face. "I am your sister. I have $5 million in venture capital debt. They will completely liquidate my entire life. Do something." I stood completely still beside the polished mahogany table. I looked at the hysterical, completely ruined woman who had intentionally called a federal security hotline to completely destroy my life, just to fund her endless string of failed luxury startups. "I am doing exactly what our father trained me to do, Evelyn," I replied quietly, my voice perfectly level, carrying the absolute, uncompromising authority of the primary corporate liquidator. "I am completely terminating a catastrophic liability from this $40 million empire. Goodbye." I turned my back on her completely. I did not watch the heavy oak doors violently swing open. I did not watch the federal marshals drag her out into the massive, echoing marble hallway. I simply listened as her hysterical, desperate screaming slowly faded into the heavy corridors of the courthouse until the heavy doors slammed shut, plunging federal probate courtroom number 4 into a profound, completely peaceful silence. The Honorable Judge Davies simply nodded his head once, officially adjourning the hearing. The surgical excision was completely successful. The toxic, greedy rot had been permanently removed from the corporate legacy. Exactly 18 months later, I stood in the harsh, bright morning sunlight pouring through the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of my father's primary executive corner office. I was wearing a sharply tailored, dark charcoal corporate suit. I held a ceramic mug of black coffee, looking out over the massive, sprawling city skyline, actively reviewing the quarterly profit margins of our newly acquired subsidiaries. The $40 million commercial liquidation empire had not just survived my father's passing. It was absolutely thriving under my unmitigated executive control. Evelyn's federal trial was spectacularly brief. Faced with the undeniable, mathematically precise biometric voice analysis conducted by the Cyber Crimes Division and the highly documented timeline of the flight confirmation codes, her high-priced defense attorney forced her to accept a brutal, completely unforgiving plea deal. She pled guilty to making a false federal terrorism threat, the illegal weaponization of a federal security agency, and first-degree attempted wire fraud. She was sentenced to exactly 8 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. to completely satisfy the massive mountain of $5 million in venture capital debt she had recklessly accumulated. The federal bankruptcy courts forced the immediate, highly aggressive liquidation of her sprawling downtown penthouse, her luxury vehicles, and every single piece of expensive designer clothing she owned. She is currently wearing a scratchy, state-issued orange jumpsuit, spending her days completely isolated in a small concrete cell, entirely abandoned by the wealthy, superficial high society friends she threw her entire life away to impress. She thought she could weaponize a federal security hotline to execute a massive corporate kidnapping and steal a $40 million inheritance. Instead, she locked her own heavy steel cell door from the inside, handed me the absolute keys to the empire, and paid for my private Gulfstream flight directly to the courthouse. If your bitter sister flagged your government identification with a fake federal terrorism tip to completely steal your massive inheritance, would you have forgiven her, or would you have used the federal agents to mathematically destroy her life? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.